on the shoulders of giants.
If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Isaac Newton. I have no conflicts of interest here, unlike Chuck Norris, who represents injured people, evidently. I'm excited, though, to tell you guys about the history of dermatology. A lot of you know the history, but I can't tell you it. I can only hope to tell it to you in a little different manner. A lot of the people that we're going to talk about today were not dermatologists. Some of them existed before our specialty was even such a thing. And many of them weren't even doctors, but their contributions to our field and our daily lives are so monumental, it would be a shame to leave them out. I have to warn you guys going ahead. Well, first off, there's nothing clinically useful in here. I've purposely scrubbed all clinically useful information from this. This is just a talk for your own enjoyment. But then as far as the warning goes, I have to tell you there's a lot of racist, there's a lot of misogynist, anti-Semitic, and just some general disturbing things going forward. So proceed at your own risk. Here's a slide of a menagerie of some of the people we're going to talk about today. So what you're looking at is considered to be the first textbook of dermatology. It was written in 1572 in Padua, Italy. And this is considered a transitional fossil, if you will, in that it bridges what comes close to current modern day thinking with the thinkings of the ancients of Hippocrates and Galen and of Avicenna. And I wanted to bring up the ancients just as a good launching off point so we can figure out how we got to where we are today. Most of you are familiar with the humoral theory of disease. It gets a couple sentences in our undergraduate textbooks and then it's completely forgotten about and rarely ever discussed. But as you remember, it has to do with balancing of the four humors of the body and the belief that all illnesses stem from an imbalance of these humors. And you can bleed people, you can purge them, you can cause them to salivate copiously in order to get these humors back in place, as well as other macabre things. But I don't think what many of us remember is that these ghostly fingers of Hippocrates and Galen have reached through history 2,000 plus years to color pretty much up to modern day thinking. Even titans of medicine like Rudolf Virchow in the late 1800s believed a lot of these theories that were put forth in classical antiquity. In addition to the humoral theory, there's also the theory of spontaneous generation, in that living matter can spring from inorganic matter or dead matter, such as mice come from wheat if left alone in a dark room, flies spring from filth, and moths spring from wool. Let's say you get into Doc Brown's time machine and zip back to 1400, and somebody asks you, why does this kid have curly hair? All your knowledge of disulfide bonds and keratin wouldn't be worth a damn to these people. The correct answer to a humoral doctor is this kid has curly hair because he has an abundance of heat, obviously. And if you want proof of this, you just go to the baths, and you'll see a lot of people enter the baths with straight hair, and they leave and their hair is curly because it got hot. And if you want further proof, the attendants of the bath often have curly hair. And for my home run argument, if you go to Ethiopia, a lot of those people have curly hair too because there's an abundance of heat there. So back to our textbook from 1572. This is a collection of conversations and teaching vignettes from a master to his pupils on the cutaneous ailments. If you're curious how this book reads, here's a sample. The skin, all physicians apparently agree, has been placed about the bodies of animals as a protective covering of the flesh and members. Hippocrates in his book on bones seems to have said that it is a binding for the body parts, which being individually separate require a common bond, and this is the skin. Thus the divine Plato rightfully likened the skin to a fisherman's net, as Galen did also. And in comparing the skin to a fisherman's net, Mercallus was actually referring to the porous quality of the skin, in which the way the skin functions as a means of eliminating waste and protecting the body from harmful substances. I think this is the first example, well, it's the first one I could find, an example where somebody's actually recognizing the skin as the interface between the body and the environment. I mentioned earlier that this is a early transitional fossil in our thinking, and Mercallus disagreed with Galen. Galen had taught that lice were generated to, quote, keep people alert, and that's why so many sailors had lice, because they had to stay alert and look out for rocks and such. Well, Mercallus reasoned this had no purpose in children whatsoever, so he felt they were evil humors that were spontaneously generated from internal ailments. He also disagreed with the prevailing Arab idea and argued against it, that a lot of these dermatoses at the time were caused from retained menstrual pollution that were carried over from birth. In 1576, the Venetian government hired Mercallus to come give an opinion on whether or not the city was being afflicted by the plague. He determined it wasn't the plague, and subsequently quite a few people died because it did turn out to be the plague. Nevertheless, he retired rich and famous, and we're still talking about him today. We're going to stay in Italy now. You're looking at the drawing of a bathhouse for galley slaves. And it's believed that this is the first place that someone discovered scabies, associated it with the rash, and also successfully treated it with sulfur for 4 or 5 days. And that person was Giovanni Cosimo Bonomo. This was about 100 years after Hieronymus' textbook. So Bonomo not only discovered the cause of scabies in this bathhouse for slaves, but he also discovered how to treat it, and then his discovery was completely forgotten for about 200 years. The ancients knew of scabies, but they just thought it was an external manifestation of ill-balanced humors. Now, Bonomo described and drew the mite in 1687, and he wrote in some letters that he described or observed a minute living creature with 6 feet and a sharp head. Now, the Pope's chief physician at the time began to dispute with Bonomo regarding this, because the Pope's physician believed in the classics that it was an internal ailment, just manifested externally, and he started to quote scripture and started to escalate the conversation. Well, Bonomo looked around and saw what happened to other scientists of his day, like Galileo, and he was persuaded not to continue the debate, and then his discovery was completely forgotten. Now, scabies, leprosy, and plague had already been vexing physicians since antiquity, but in the so-called Old World, the real game changer came in 1492 when syphilis debuted, right after Columbus returned from the New World. And as you know, syphilis kept doctors busy and was part of the reason dermatology branched off into its own field. Most of you know the realm of STDs was one of derm's original focus due to the many cutaneous manifestations. So where did syphilis originate? The New World, the Old World? In both? This question has kept paleopathologists busy for quite some time, and it's fascinating reading. I encourage you to do more if you have any interest in it. But yaws, penta, Bejel, syphilis, they're all related, and this organism seems to morph to fit whatever environment it's in for its own survival. The idea that Columbus brought it back from the New World is called the Columbian hypothesis, and there are written accounts that Columbus enslaved native women in the Caribbean and brought them back and sold them into brothels in Europe, which would only potentiate the spread of this disease. But this disease may have existed in Europe prior to this, and maybe Columbus brought back a cofactor. Again, it's a complex, fascinating question with no clear answer at this time. It's believed the first person to write about this disease was Ruy Diaz of Barcelona in 1493, and he wrote that it has pleased divine justice to give us and send us unknown afflictions, which turned up and was observed in the year of our Lord 1493 in the city of Barcelona. This disease had its origin and birth once and for all in the island called Hispaniola, which is Haiti in the DR. And I call it the serpentine disease of the island of Hispaniola, because according to its lonesomeness, I do not know of anything to which I could more naturally compare it to than the serpent. For as the serpent is abominable, terrifying, and horrible, so is this disease abominable, terrifying, and horrible. It is a Graves' disease that separates and corrupts the flesh and breaks and rots the bones and disrupts and contracts the sinews, and consequently, I give it that name. Those of us in the post-penicillin era, it's hard for us to imagine a disease like this. Imagine a disease so horrible that we just called it Satan's disease or the devil's ulcer. Syphilis' big debut, though, occurred in August of 1494 when King Charles VIII of France led an army of about 50,000 soldiers and a large artillery train into northern Italy. And the soldiers were mostly mercenaries from all over Western Europe, including Spain, and of course they were accompanied by their prostitute camp followers. As I mentioned before, syphilis was the serpent's disease at that time, and the syphilis that we deal with today is a muted form of whatever hit Europe in the 1490s. In fact, just about 10-15 years later, physicians were writing about how the disease really mellowed out. It wasn't uncommon for some of these syphilitic lesions to actually erode into bone and cause death in a matter of weeks to months at that time. In fact, syphilis was such a large part of European life in that time that's mentioned many times throughout Shakespeare's work. Most of us are familiar with the term "a pox upon your house." Well, it was called the Great Pox for a reason. Then several hundred years later, the French author Voltaire wrote, "On their flippant way through Italy, the French carelessly picked up Genoa, Naples, and syphilis. Then they were thrown out and deprived of Genoa and Naples. But they did not lose everything. Syphilis went with them." But it wasn't until after 40 years of Charles VIII invading Italy that syphilis got its name. Prior to that, it was a serpent's disease, or the luz had many other names. The term syphilis was first applied by the Italian physician and poet Girolamo Fracastoro. And Fracastoro was known as the greatest physician of his age, and some authors even called him the second greatest person of the Italian Renaissance, right behind Leonardo da Vinci. And his poem reads, in part, "O Muse, reveal to me what seed has grown This evil for that long remained unknown, till Spanish sailors made west their goal and plowed the seas to find another pole. So up until now, you can ask, why don't we call this the Spanish disease? After all, he did call his poem syphilis or the French disease. Well, a later line from his poem says, "From Naples first it came, from France, and justly took from France its name." The name syphilis doesn't exist in any ancient Greek literature. It's a pure invention of Fracastoro's, even though it's told like it's an ancient Greek myth. Well, Syphilis was a shepherd who was tending his sheep, and a drought struck. His sheep started to die. He became angered at the gods, knocked down all the altars to the gods, and then started to worship the king because he felt like the king could give him relief. Well, this pleased the king immensely, and the king went with it. And this angered the gods, particularly Apollo, the sun god, who sent down a plague that struck as its first victim syphilis and eventually even afflicted the king. The high priest then consult a wood nymph named America, or Americia, depending on how it's translated. And she says that in order to appease the gods, you have to have a human sacrifice. And who do you think is nominated for that? Of course, Syphilis. And he's all done up with garland on his head, and his throat is pulled back, ready for the knife. It's a very Isaac Abraham type moment, when all of a sudden the goddess Juno appears. And Juno stays Syphilis's execution and says instead that a heifer would do. Fracastoro tells the tale of syphilis over 3 acts. The last one was written about 20 years after the first 2. And in it, a noble sailor, i.e. Columbus, sails to this new land to find riches for their kingdom, Spain. And in the process, they end up killing some sacred parrots of Diana. Well, this angers Diana, who's the sister of Apollo, the sun god. Apollo is about to unleash the plague of syphilis on them when some natives come out of the bushes, and these natives that Fracastoro describes are humanoid with skin as black as jet. And they share with the sailors that they have syphilis amongst themselves, but they keep it at bay because the goddess Juno has told them about the guaiacum tree. This guaiac is the same stool guaiac on our fecal occult blood test that many of us used to do when we did primary care. I thought it was a good historical tie-in. Guaiac had been disproven as a cure for syphilis by Paracelsus quite some time before this poem. But this third act is a commercial for guaiac. So why did Fracastoro champion guaiac? Well, if you remember, the Holy Roman Emperor kicked Charles VIII of Spain out of Italy, where Fracastoro was from. So Fracastoro was a subject of the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Holy Roman Empire was funded largely by a company called the Fugger banking family. And the Fuggers had set up a chain of hospitals throughout Europe in order to treat syphilis solely with guaiac. In addition, the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, held a sole monopoly on the importation of guaiac from the New World to the Old. Divine guaiac, we salute you, pride of the New World, and it was Spain that brought your marvelous properties back. So not only should Spain be absolved from bringing the disease back from the New World, they should be celebrated because they brought back this glorious cure of guaiac for this nasty French disease of Charles VIII. This is a drawing that accompanied Fracastoro's poem, and on the far right you see the Syrian hunter Acilius, who was also afflicted with syphilis in the first part of the poem. And he receives treatment of mercury in the underworld after he kills some of Diana's sacred deer and is also cursed by Apollo. And there's a lot going on in this drawing. On the far left you see a statue of Venus who has some type of fluid flowing from her breast into a cistern, where it then goes into a river or a little stream. And you see Fracastoro in the middle warning people not to drink from contaminated wetness. And then you see poor Syphilis drinking downstream, not only from Venus's excretions, as well as a dog urinating slightly upstream from him. At the base of the cistern, there's a woman playing a lute, and she has her hair done up to look like devil horns. And she has a little sign beneath her in Latin that says, "Come here and join your limbs with me in a desirable embrace while my husband is absent, while there is no fear." Fracastoro presides today over the Piazza del Signore of Verona. And according to popular legend, he's holding a stone ball in his right hand that represents the world. And it will fall when the first honorable person walks underneath this arch. And for a long time, gonorrhea and syphilis were not known to be separate diseases. It was just called the venereal disease, or the VD, from the Greek goddess Venus of love. We're going to go to the 1700s England now, and we're going to meet a character that could have only existed at that time period John Hunter. He's just this gloriously outrageous surgeon. And there's a book about him called The Knife Man I encourage you to read. He believed that syphilis and gonorrhea were the same disease, and you could treat them both just with mercury and ignore any other treatments. So he put his money where his mouth is. And this so-called misbegotten experiment is aptly named because the story is he took an active pustule from a patient and infected himself with it. And he gave himself a painful sexual disease, and this hindered STD research for nearly half a century because he convinced so many people just to use mercury vapor and to cut out the infected sores, believing it would stop syphilis from spreading. Going into the 1900s, we still didn't know what caused syphilis. And because of the abysmally high rate of syphilis in Germany, the government took action and recalled the famous parasitologist Fritz Sheldon from the tropics, and they paired him with the dermatologist Erich Hoffmann, and together they discovered the treponemal organism. Hoffmann's an interesting character because he was dismissed from his position at Bonn University because he openly referred to the brown shirts as the brown shits. And he was the only prominent non-Jewish dermatologist that criticized the Nazis' treatment of his fellow Jewish professors. So this is a wonderful photograph. You're looking at a picture of the first treponemal organism ever seen, and Fritz and Hoffmann discovered it in 1905. It's from a papule on the vulva of a woman who had secondary syphilis. Hoffmann wrote, "Sheldon had a preconceived idea that the cause of syphilis was an animal parasite. We often worked late into the night till the light of the incandescent electric globe was neutralized by the morning rays of sunshine. One day we hit the jackpot. Sheldon let out a yell and said, 'Here it is!' I crowded him away from the scope and peering into the eyepiece saw a shadowy spiral form, slowly turning like a gimlet and at the same time swimming like a fish in slow motion. We were sure this gimlet was the cause, but could not prove it at the time." And because so many organisms had been proposed to be the cause, they met fierce criticism of their work. When Sheldon presented his findings at the Medical Society, one moderator stood up and said, "This terminates the discussion until the cause of syphilis is brought again before us next week by somebody else." And words I'm sure he regretted. A few years later, in 1909, still in Germany, we meet now one of the true giants of medicine. And although he's largely forgotten today by most of us, he was quite a rock star and should still be remembered as such. He was an eccentric fellow. His name was Paul Ehrlich. He smoked 25 cigars a day and was at home in the beer halls, even though a colleague said all he ever did was smoke cigars and drink mineral water. And he was not formally trained in bacteriology or experimental chemistry, but we're going to find we meet Paul at several points in our talk. He wasn't a one-trick pony for sure. He had this idea for a so-called magic bullet, that is a drug designed to target just one disease. And he came up with this idea after playing around with these newly invented synthetic dyes that were derivatives of coal tar. And he noticed that some microorganisms would take up these new dyes and others wouldn't. So he reasoned that this differentiation might allow a toxic dye to kill tissue and leave other tissue intact that didn't stain with the dye. So he invents the first real targeted treatment for syphilis, and also just coins the term chemotherapy in the process. With the support of his research assistant, Dr. Sachihiro Hata, Ehrlich discovered in 1909 compound 606. Why 606? Because it was the 606th compound to actually be tested. It was marketed under the name Salvarsan, and it became the most widely prescribed drug in the world. You'll still hear it mentioned in various older movies like Out of Africa. Now, it was a arsenic derivative. And at the time, arsenic was described as the inheritor's powder. And you could go down to the drugstore and buy arsenic trioxide to poison your family members with. So he met a lot of pushback on this because people wondered how such a dangerous substance could ever be thought of as a cure. Because it was arsenic-based, it had a very narrow therapeutic window. In fact, Ehrlich fought a continuing battle with physicians to standardize his treatment and to eliminate the carelessness. He was quoted as saying, "You cannot have any idea what sort of blockheads one has to deal with. Those wretched scoundrels are really going to ruin Salvarsan entirely because they will not pay attention to my methods." And as we have our medical deniers and anti-vaxxers today, they existed in our yesterdays too. This is Carl Wassman. He's an outrageous character of his day, kind of an Alex Jones of the 1900s. And he had a self-published newspaper he called The Free Thinker that he would often distribute amongst cafes and restaurants, dressed as a monk with his white cowl and sandals on. Well, he claimed that the hospitals in the area were experimenting on the city's prostitutes with Salvarsan and using them as guinea pigs against their will. And The main hospital, which was headed by Dr. Herxheimer from the Jeris-Herxheimer reaction, sued him for defamation, and it ended up going to court. Well, Wassmann packed the courtroom with the pimps and the prostitutes of Frankfurt, and they acted out and created these kind of outrageous circumstances, and they acted out. It was a circus of a trial. And Ehrlich was called as an expert witness to defend the hospital and Dr. Herxheimer. And it's widely agreed that the whole affair broke Ehrlich's constitution. He ended up dying about a year later. But in a great quote, Ehrlich says in the courtroom, he says, "I am tired of these anti-injectionists, anti-Semitics, anti-vivisectionists, and naturopaths." It's hard to overstate how much hope was around Salvarsan. For the first time since Charles invaded northern Italy, there's actually hope to be reasonably cured. And a movie was made of the development of the magic bullet called Paul Ehrlich's Magic Bullet. You can still get it on Amazon at this time. And the climactic scene of the movie involves a courtroom battle where Dr. Ehrlich is being brought up on charges for having killed 38 patients with Salvarsan. And then the key witness says, "I believe the Salvarsan is responsible not for 38, but for 39 deaths." And everyone gasps, and he says, "The death of syphilis itself." And then Ehrlich is exonerated. As I said before, Paul Ehrlich is a big deal. There's even a crater of the moon named after him, and he was on the German mark for quite some time. In World War I, Salvarsan supplies in the United States became critically low as Germany cut off supplies. Luckily, Frank Schomburg from Schomburg's disease in 1915 started to manufacture it here, much to the anger of the German patent holders. And I have to say, he is quite a dapper dresser in this picture. But he got his raw material through the blockade-breaking German merchant submarine called the Deutschland, which made several trips to the United States clandestinely, but was eventually captured and taken over by the German Imperial Navy in 1917. Keeping the fighting forces syphilis-free became important to all parties involved in World War I, so much so that the Nazis even set up war brothels where the ladies were routinely treated with Salvarsan or Neo-Salvarsan. And in America, the doughboys were fined 10% of their pay if they were diagnosed with an STD. And for those of you that fight the government's position that they can mandate you wear a mask, you'll really lose your mind over this Chamberlain-Kahn Act of 1918, or the so-called American Plan. The intention behind it was to keep women from spreading syphilis and STDs to multiple men. What it accomplished was a lot of women that were out walking around by themselves at night or in small groups were arrested or abducted by local authorities and subjected to sexual disease testing, which amounted to sexual assault. The tests were of dubious benefits at that time anyway. And then, without any kind of due process, they were locked up or interred until they tested negative. There's a great book called The Trials of Nina McCall, if you're interested in exploring this subject further. Kansas, though, did everybody an extra one-up, and they had a Kansas State Law Chapter 205, where you could be locked up for allegedly being a, quote, dirty girl, again, without any due process. And there's a lot of heartbreaking stories of girls getting sent to these concentration camps just from a scorned lover or from a jealous wife of somebody that she had eyes for at the time. This law permitted the isolation and the quarantine of persons to, quote, prevent spread and dissemination of diseases dangerous to public health. And over a 25-year period, about 5,300 women were either interred or imprisoned for these violations. Another interesting fact I found out was that during medieval times, women that were considered beautiful, or young girls that were considered beautiful, were considered a threat to public health and as well as people's marriages and the public good. And in Italy and Germany, many girls were locked up from the ages of 12 to 18 until they were married or they became nuns, pretty much for the public good, but probably only the pretty ones. I was sharing this story with a colleague of mine who's in his early 80s and still practicing with me, and he said it wasn't uncommon in the 70s when he started practice in our small town for some fathers to bring their daughters in on a Friday night and 5150 them for 48 hours because they thought they had a promiscuous weekend ahead of them. In 1932, the Public Health Service worked with the Tuskegee Institute, and they wanted to record the natural history of syphilis and the evolution of the disease. And they decided to do it in poor black men, and the study was called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. So even after penicillin became the standard of treatment in 1947, the Public Health Service let this study go on. And it wasn't only until 1972, when the media broke the story, did the Public Health Service stop experimenting on black Southerners. Again, 1972. That really freaks me out. We were biomedically experimenting on American citizens in 1972, and we all grumble about having to do informed consent today. I think informed consent protects us from ourselves if you stop and think about it. Let's finally leave syphilis behind and move on to some other topics. What does this painting of Captain John Smith and Pocahontas have to do with dermatology? Well, in 1624, the explorer John Smith published the first written account of poison ivy. He wrote, "The poisoned weed is much in shape like our English ivy, but being but touched causeth redness, itching, and lastly blisters." He went on to defend the plant, since the blisters, in Smith's words, were, "after a while passeth away of themselves without further harm, yet because of the time they are somewhat painful, the plant hath got itself an ill name, though questionless of no ill nature." In other words, he said, we shouldn't call this thing poison ivy because I live in an age where people really die of poison, and quit being a weenie and complaining about your itching. Western poison oak, which haunts my neck of the woods here in California, was first described by David Douglas, whom the Douglas fir is named after. And Douglas was an interesting character as well. He's a Pacific Rim botanist who died or was murdered by falling into a bull pit trap when he was in Hawaii. Poison ivy was such a novelty and rage back in England that they grew it at many of the royal gardens. Skin complexity wasn't really understood, though, until the work of Malpighi, who used this new invention called the microscope to take a look at what the cells were. And besides what you see listed on the screen there, he had a famous work where he dissected a black man. And Malpighi made some groundbreaking headway into the discovery of the origin of black skin, which had fascinated Europeans. He found that black pigment was associated with, quote, a layer of mucus just beneath the skin. And this was revolutionary, although it's primitive sounding. It was revolutionary because the idea existed that African skin was black because it was stained black from black bile. And black bile was supposed to be cold, so it was like an internal refrigerant for their bodies. And if you're a humoralist doctor, it seems legit. And it's always curious on how we decide who discovers what. Malpighi is associated with having discovered fingerprints because he noted, quote, loops and whorls on tips of fingers, end quote. But I'm sure every primate by the age of 2 has noticed this as well. And sometimes Jan Purkinje from Purkinje Fibers is credited with discovering the uniqueness of fingerprints. But these are really Eurocentric ideas. It was known in Japan and China for thousands of years that fingerprints were unique because potters used to identify their ware by putting the fingerprints in. And ancient Assyrians would sign their cuneiform tablets with a thumbprint as well, too. Okay, this is really cool. You're looking at the first documented melanoma. It's from England, 1787, and it was a metastatic lesion, and it's the first known melanoma to be obtained for permanent sections. But no one looked at it until 1968, so no one had any clue what it was. Now, melanoma was known to Hippocrates. He wrote of such briefly, had no idea what it was, and then Peruvian pre-Columbian mummies have been discovered with melanoma as well. And the person who surgically removed it is our old friend John Hunter from the misbegotten experiment of syphilis. And it's not clear that he knew what he was dealing with, but he had the foresight to put it in a jar where it stayed preserved all those hundreds of years. And the man that he took the tumor off of, the tumor was on the angle of the jaw, and it had been removed 3 years earlier. But this man got drunk in a bar and got into a squabble and took a nightstick or a baton to the tumor. Someone hit him with a beer bottle or something, and then it started to grow exponentially after that. And that's when he went to Hunter to have it cut out. And how many times have patients told you that, oh, I had something happen, a dog bit me there, or, I had a lawnmower slap a rock up, and now I have this tumor in the area. And I always think of John Hunter in this story whenever patients tell me that. Well, John Hunter may have been credited with the first excision of a melanoma, but René Linnaeus was actually credited with describing it and knowing what it was, and recognizing that it was unrelated to black carbon deposits that were typically found on the lungs of patients on autopsies. In fact, in a lecture he gave in Paris in 1804 and a later book he published in 1806, he coined the term melanose to describe these tumors. And his publication of the melanoma led to a rift with his mentor, Baron Dupuytren. Many of you remember René Linnaeus as the inventor of the stethoscope. An interesting quote I found about him was that, quote, he stood maybe 5'2" and dashed about the hospital, although he had knowledge of his coming early death. He looked like a whisper, but acted like the whirlwind. His skin was pulled just tight enough on his body to keep his bones from poking through. He was but a breath of air, but functioned like a Hercules. René succumbed to an early death from tuberculosis. Now, in North America, Isaac Parrish documented the first melanoma in 1837 in a 43-year-old widow in Philadelphia. She had a fungus tumor upon her toe. This melanoma was described to have originated from a, quote, purple mark or mole about the size of a mulberry, which was supposed to have been congenital. Dr. Parrish ended up applying poultices of ground elm, purgatives, and leeches to the groin, but the patient soon succumbed to her disease. And although René Linnaeus claimed to be the first person to describe melanoma, his teacher, Baron Dupuytren from Dupuytren's Contracture, claimed the honor as well, and this led to quite a falling out between the two. Dupuytren melanosis was a term for melanoma that was used shortly after this period in some of the literature. Now, evidently, the Baron was a brilliant teacher and a gifted surgeon, but lacked in personal skills. He was known as the brigand of the hospital and first among surgeons, but least among men. And there's a statue outside of his old hospital where locals have dressed the Baron up from everything from Darth Maul to Johnny Cash to the Joker to Freddy Krueger. Now, by very strange coincidence or intersecting of fate, two of the diseases the Baron is most noted with have intersected hundreds of years later in the form of a therapy that could not even have been imagined in his day. And that is that Dupuytren's Contracture has recently been described as a rare side effect of BRAF inhibitors for melanoma. And now across the English Channel we go to meet the founder of modern dermatology, Robert Willen. Now, Robert Willen was such a giant of Western European dermatology that his name even became an adjective for a style of dermatologists. And for instance, some elite dermatologists in other countries would call themselves the French Willenist dermatologists or the Austrian Willenists. And that referred to the style of diagnosing and classifying a disease based off its basic lesion. That's pretty impressive when your name becomes an adjective of dermatology. And Willen's portrait was also on the cover of the British Journal of Dermatology for many, many years. He worked at this place called the Carey Street Dispensary in London and spent much of his medical career caring for the poor and underprivileged. And at that time period, you can imagine the plethora of dermatological conditions he got to see and the proximity he had to filth and squalor and the lack of baths and the bathing, which would lead to all types of dermatologic diseases for him to describe. His publication on cutaneous disease has been called the single most important piece ever published in dermatology. Up until this time, we didn't know how to communicate with each other, and we had no formalized language. Well, Robert Willen changed all of that and codified a way for us to speak to one another. It was the first classification of dermatology that precisely defined the terms and used and then fitted individual diseases into a single class, rather than just considering different stages of the same disease as different maladies that belong to different classes, as prior classification systems were really just all over the place. He ended up teaching a dermatologist named Bateman, who published a lot of Willen's work after he had passed away. Then Bateman ended up teaching Addison from Addison's disease. Erasmus Wilson is also an interesting English character. He published his Practical Treatise on Healthy Skin, which is still in print today from 1845, and it also did a great deal to inform regular people on the benefits of consulting a dermatologist if you had a skin disease. He published a classic descriptions of lichen planus, neurotic excoriations, delusions of parasitosis, and nevus areneus. One of the things Erasmus Wilson is known for in England is that he helped bring the needle of Cleopatra to the island after it was dug out of the sand after having been buried for 2,000 years. He paid the equivalent of $1 million in 2020 money today. It was 10,000 pounds at the time to transport this needle that had been gifted to the British government but yet had languished for decades due to lack of funds being able to bring it out of Alexandria. The obelisk is called the Needle of Cleopatra, but it had nothing to do with Cleopatra. It was originally erected in the Egyptian city of Heliopolis by the orders of Thutmose III around 1450 BC. We go back across the English Channel now to meet a truly bizarre individual, Baron Jean-Louis Albert of France. And he is part P.T. Barnum and part dermatologist. He was quite well known in France. He became the personal physician of King Louis XVIII and was later personal physician to Charles X, where he was awarded the title of Baron. He was the first person to describe mycosis fungoides, and in 1818 he was the first person to describe psoriatic arthritis as well. So he's certainly not without his academic merits. One of the things that makes Albert so interesting to me is that not only did he hold grand rounds, he held theaters of dermatology. And his lectures were so good that they attracted foreigners, celebrities, well-known physicians from other countries, and they got so popular you had to move them outside. And there's a painting from 1811 that represents the lessons at the Hospital of St. Louis, where Albert is standing on a wooden platform and the audience is sitting around in benches. Again, it's like an outdoor grand rounds for the general public, where everyone wants to just saunter up and watch. And the patients would have these placards on their chest, and in 5-centimeter letters, it would have the names of their diseases. And he would beckon them on stage by saying, come up mycosis fungoides, or come up syphilis. And he would describe the skin diseases in a theatrical way in his southern French accent that was supposedly very pleasant. And his lectures were filled with metaphor and original humor. An example of this is when one of the syphilitic prostitutes comes up and he describes her in this flowery prose as a priestess of Venus wounded by the pediferous dart of love. He was known to do outrageous things in his show. For instance, he would take buckets of scales from psoriatic patients and just shower the first couple rows of his audience in these psoriatic scales, things that wouldn't fly today. But although this sounds like it was part freak show, part grand rounds, Albert was famous for his treatment and kind benevolence toward a lot of his patients. It was also said that he would roam the streets and pick up sick patients in his personal carriage and whisk them away to the hospital. But the more cynically minded among us may say he was actually just out there collecting specimens for his show. Albert became increasingly irritated that many French dermatologists were identifying themselves as Willenists. And not to be outdone, he decided that he was going to conceive of his own way in order to make derm diagnoses. So he said he wished to present a method and not a classification for a diagnosis like Wilhelm did. So after 2 years of work in secret, Albert gave a much-awaited lesson on April 26, 1829, where he unveiled the tree of dermatologic diseases. Only a few days later, one of his former students, Bait, who was a rival at this time, gave his own lecture on this tree of dermatoses and found that it was essentially useless and that French dermatologists should prefer the Willenist method, as it was clearer and a little more easy and natural to use. Examples he gave was that eczema was not even part of the eczematous dermatosis on the tree, and psoriasis could be found nowhere on the tree at all. So it's been said by some of Albert's students that, quote, we had fun with Albert, but we had our education with Biet. And I thought we'd finish up with a little curiosity here. One of Albert's students a few years later, the man's name is Dermatology, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but published his 4-point system on how to diagnose eczema. And number 1, redness of the diseased surface, okay? Number 2, constant itching that varies in intensity, I'll buy that. Number 3, secretion of a clear, yellowish, serous discharge that stains linen gray and stiffens it, as does semen. And I've been tempted to put that on my next prior authorization for dupilumab, but my nurses advise against it. This gentleman also published one of the first articles on nummular eczema and noted that it has a tenacity to resist treatment, which I continually find in my day-to-day experience as well. And so we come to an end of the first part of this 2-part series. I sincerely hope you've learned absolutely nothing but have enjoyed it. I'm going to end with a trivia question that we'll pick up next time. Who is credited with designing the first placebo-controlled blind trial? Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, Louis Pasteur, or John Hunter? Please join me for On Shoulders of the Giants, Part 2.